the Volkswagen Transporter. Workhorse, recreational vehicle and style icon. Let's find out what goes wrong. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the engine. So the T5, it's been with us since 2003, facelifted in 2009, finally replaced in 2015. There's a number of different engines used. They started off with the 1.9 PD diesel. They've obviously moved on to the tried and tested 2-litre common rail. You'll also find them with the 5-cylinder 2.5-litre diesels. For the most part, it's a pretty reliable engine. The 1.9, most people know by now, they're pretty indestructible and they just keep on going and going. We start to look at these vehicles with an average of 200,000 miles coming for servicing and so on. We start to notice things like oil leaks. So with the 2-litre common rail diesel, which is probably the most common engine we see fitted in these, crank seals, front and rear, can be a bit of an issue. The rocker cover gasket also gives us a few problems, and the externally mounted oil coolers, which also houses the filter housing. We do see quite a few issues with the gaskets fitted on those. The 2-litre diesel, we've also seen a few issues with oil pumps. Now obviously, start to have a bit of an oil pump failure, this can lead on to other issues, particularly turbo related. So if you see that oil light come on, get it checked out as soon as possible. The 2.5-litre, so this is the 5-cylinder diesel. Again, it's quite a popular engine. Now these are cam driven rather than chain driven or cam belt driven, and they have had a few issues with the water pump. The seals fail and this in turn knocks out the bearings in the water pump. It's quite an expensive job, it's quite labour intensive, with it being sort of cam wheels rather than a cam belt or a timing chain. Another biggie with these 2-litre diesels is the EGR system. The EGR valve and the EGR cooler can both cause problems. EGR cooler, we've seen oil leaks externally and internally. We've also seen quite a lot of issues with the EGR valve sticking. This causes a knock-on effect with the rest of your emission system. Pay particular attention, guys, if you've got the bi-turbo. Now the bi-turbo is slightly different design. The EGR, again, is completely different from the standard 2-litre. Now unfortunately these did have a bit of an issue with them starting to break down internally. That's sort of stuff that was going on inside the EGR, that all gets washed through. It goes back into the system via the EGR. That then unfortunately goes inside the cylinders and causes like a wash effect and a scoring effect on the bores. Now this can lead to excessive oil consumption, smoking, and let's be honest, once that starts to happen, unfortunately that's terminal, so definitely one to keep an eye open for. Also worth mentioning, particularly on a vehicle that's essentially a commercial sort of, you know, it's a cargo carrier first and foremost, and that is injectors. So these things work hard. It does put a lot of pressure on the various parts of the system, and unfortunately one of the weak points on these is the injectors. They're not a cheap repair, but thankfully there are a lot of aftermarket products around, so just another one to keep an eye open for. Okay, so we're going to move away from the engine. We're going to speak more about the other mechanical components on the vehicle. So directly on from the engine, obviously we move on to the transmission, the gearbox. Bit of a weak point on most modern vehicles is probably the dual mass flywheel. Now on a vehicle that's done in excess of 150,000 miles, again, it's a cargo carrier. Those dual mass flywheels, they do start to get a little bit noisy. They can be a little bit intimidating, and to be fair, it can actually sound like an engine knock. It can give you almost a misfire sort of scenario, but it is literally just the link between the engine and the gearbox. And it's basically a dual plate. they start to vibrate, or in some cases they lock off in one position. They start to run a little bit rough, they start to get noisy, and at that point it is literally just a new flywheel, and while you're at it, you might as well get your clutch changed at the same time. While we're on the subject of the gearbox, we also have seen quite a few issues with the drive shafts. Now obviously this is the drive directly from the transmission to the front wheels, or in some cases the rear wheels. And what tends to happen with these, they're a hard working vehicle. They're held together by a spline with a simple press fit, and unfortunately those splines do start to wear out. Now once they do wear out, they start to slip inside the transmission housing, and you just lose all drive. You'll get a horrible grinding noise. It sounds a lot worse than it actually is. Thankfully the components are readily available. They're pretty easy to change. It's just that awkward scenario of getting this vehicle off the side of the road, off the motorway, down to your local garage. So a quick word about the steering. The steering on these is pretty reliable. We don't see a lot of issues with it. Probably the most common problem, and when I say common, I mean it's one that we see more than anything else, and that is the steering column. It has a universal joint on the bottom where it connects up to the steering rack, and we have seen a few scenarios on those where they start to go a little bit stiff, and as you turn it, it works fine for 90 degrees, but then starts to lock up for the next 90 degrees and then freeze off, locks up, freeze off. Starts to give you a very awkward steering sensation, almost as though you're losing your power steering. But it is literally just a partial seizure of that lower universal joint. Pretty easy to replace, and again, it's just one of those things. And then we move on to suspension. So the suspension on the van, it is pretty hard wearing. It's designed to carry a bit of weight, but like anything, it's prone to failure. In particular, we see a lot of broken springs, especially on the back of these vehicles. If they're empty, if there's nothing in it, there's a lot more movement than necessary, and obviously those springs are going up and down. You get the weight in it. As soon as you get that weight in it, you put that little bit of extra pressure on, and before you know it, it's banging around like no one's business. And on the front end, we do see the occasional spring failure, not so much, but we also do get problems with bushes on the front suspension, and in particular the bottom ball joints are quite prone to failure. Now the Transporter is a great vehicle. Although it's designed as a commercial vehicle, it feels and drives just like a car, a little bit bigger obviously. Now the biggest difference between the cars and the commercial vehicles is they don't tend to cram a lot of electrical sort of toys and goodies on the commercial vehicles. They try to keep them very, very simple. I mean, don't get me wrong, they've got plenty of things in there to keep you occupied. You can play with the electric window switches all day long. So electrically wise, they're not too bad. We don't see a lot of electrical issues. A couple of things that we do come across every now and again. We have had customer complaints, vehicles driving along and it's telling you that one of the side doors or the rear doors are open. We have seen quite a few switch failures or module failures fitted inside the doors, so that is definitely one thing to watch out for. And the other thing to watch out for is the power sockets. So you've got your sat-nav plugged in, you've got your phone charging up, you've got whatever else on the go, and it pops the fuse. It's not the end of the world, but what tends to happen with these is people have got no idea where that fuse is. You can spend hours looking through the fuse box and it's just not there. So in most of the standard vans, it's not been converted. The front passenger seat actually lifts up and there's a storage compartment inside. And if you have a little look in there, there's just a solitary fuse sitting there all on its own. And that's the one you need to replace for your power socket. So you can't have failed to notice the camper van. It's bright yellow, it stands out a little. There's a lot of them around. So the Transporter, people have been converting these to camper vans pretty much from day one. And it's something now that even Volkswagen themselves are getting involved with. They do their own version, which is the California, and you'll see them just about everywhere you go. The only problem is, there's no sort of standard to how these things are converted. So a lot of people will do it themselves. There's a lot of companies that will professionally convert them. And obviously the manufacturer themselves now produce their own versions. So if you're buying one, there's a few things really you should look out for. So if it has been converted, what a lot of people tend to do is there's a lot of styling cues. There'll be a lot of sort of colour changes. They will have fitted lowering skirts, lowering springs, they'll have fitted bigger wheels. So take a drive in it first and foremost, make sure there's no knocking noises, make sure it's comfortable. If you're going to be using it as a camper van and you're going to be doing on average 250, 300 miles per trip, you want something that's not going to give you a bad back halfway through the journey. Another thing to watch out for is if it was originally a panel van, a lot of people will have fitted their own windows. Make sure they're bonded correctly, make sure they're a good snug fit, make sure they're not going to drop out the first time you wash it. Make sure they're not leaking. You do not want a leak into one of these vehicles. Sometimes it can be almost impossible to find where that leak is coming from. And again, the same goes for if it's had a pop-up roof fitted. So there's lots of variations available. There's a lot of companies doing it. There's a lot of people doing it themselves. Make sure it's been done properly, make sure it's been done professionally, and make sure it's not leaking. You definitely don't want water seeping into your mattress. So another thing with the conversions, you're going to have auxiliary heaters fitted, underfloor heating. You'll have extra components in the back, so you'll probably have a 240 volt system running through it with the hookups. Now, all of those components, they at some point will have pipes, wires and so on running inside and outside the main cab of the vehicle. So if you're looking at one, if you're thinking of buying one, if it has had these components fitted, just have a quick look if you can where those components come in through the vehicle. Make sure they've been professionally treated where any holes have been drilled. Make sure there are no sharp edges. If you've got any fuel pipes or electric cables running through, you don't want any of those chafing on the main body of the vehicle. Okay guys, so don't be put off by our little list of common faults. They're a lot more reliable than it sounds. It's the reason why they're probably the #1 commercial vehicle available today. They've been around a long time and they're incredibly versatile. You know, that's why we see so many of them on the road. Whether you're transporting people, whether you're taking it away for the weekend on a camping trip, or whether you're just using it to get goods from A to B. Very reliable vehicle, well worth the money, even though they are a little bit expensive. So we'll join you next time for another video. So don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that share button, and we'll see you again for the next video.